Why do Americans say soccer? I know. If you're not from the US, you're already groaning. But hold on. The irony is actually really interesting. The word soccer was actually invented in England. They just didn't stop using it. Let's roll back the clock to the mid-1800s, when sports were being formalized across England. There were two dominant versions of football back then. One played with the hands and rough tackles, which became known as rugby football, and one played with your feet, which became known as association football. In 1863, the rules of association football were officially written down by the newly formed Football Association in London. This was the birth of the modern game we now know as football, aka soccer. But it wasn't called that officially. Enter Oxford University. You wouldn't know it now, but back then, the boys at Oxford University added ER, to everything that they talked about, apparently. Rugby became known as rugger, and association football, they thought that was too long. So they shortened association to ASSOC, A-S-S-O-C, and then to soccer, S-O-C-C-A, and formally gave it that Oxford finish, soccer, which is S-O-C-C-E-R, which we know today. That's right, soccer is basically British boarding school slang, circa 1880s. You'd think that soccer would only be limited to its use in Oxford, but that wasn't the case. It wasn't a fringe word in the UK. It was used commonly and casually. One of the earliest uses of soccer was actually in the press in the Daily Mail in 1905. The word was widely accepted in both written and spoken English in the UK through the early 20th century. The Times of England used to use soccer multiple times in the 1950s and 60s, sometimes even in headlines. The BBC used it well into the 1980s, especially when it came to international audiences and coverage for those audiences. Soccer was actually a very easy way to distinguish from rugby, because both games were football, and you needed to really associate and pull apart those two sports. So, if soccer was widely used in the UK, how did it translate over across the Atlantic to the US? In 1913, the US established the United States Football Association. But the problem was, Americans already had their own version of football, which is, you throw the ball, there's a gridiron, helmets, touchdowns, 7 points, the whole 9 yards. So to avoid confusion, they just decided to call the British version soccer. It wasn't meant to be rebellious, it was just meant to be practical. American football was already popular back then. By the 1920s, American newspapers like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune were using soccer as a default term. Here's one article. In 1931, the New York Times ran a paper with the headline, "Brooklyn Soccer Team to Play a National Challenge Cup." That's 90 plus years ago. And it stuck through World War II, through the launch of the NASL in the 1970s, through Pele's US debut in 1975. The word soccer stuck in American culture and in American news. But what happened in the UK? I mentioned that it was pretty widely used back in the UK too. Why did soccer fade away? Well, over time, rugby and football began to diverge in popularity. Football, as in association football, what I mentioned before, became much more dominant in everyday life. People no longer needed to say association football to distinguish it from rugby. The word football was enough. And so the word soccer, though still understood, began to sound kind of outdated or even upper class. And dare I say it, sounded American. And by the 1990s, as the Premier League exploded, both in the UK and all over the world, the Premier League became a cornerstone of global sports culture. And as American sports media started beaming into homes all over the world, the term soccer began sounding foreign. And nowadays, in many ways, Brits began to mock it as American goofiness. You can literally trace this shift. In 1995, The Guardian, a British newspaper, ran an article called "Soccer's Ugly American Problem," poking fun at US soccer culture. By the 2000s, the mockery had gone full circle. Many Brits would say things like, "Only Americans use the word soccer." Ironically, it wasn't the Americans that started the term in the first place. It was the Brits. Meanwhile, up until 2004, BBC still used the term soccer in broadcasts for global audiences, all the way up until 2004, even in places like Australia. You couldn't say football in Australia because they already had their own version of football called Aussie Rules football. So you had to still use the term soccer. Until 2005, the governing body for football, soccer, in Australia used to call themselves the Australian Soccer Association. They eventually changed it to Football Federation Australia to move away from the soccer term. But guess what? I recently visited Australia not too long ago, and some people still use the term soccer. To summarize all this, the British actually invented the term soccer. The Americans, Australians, Canadians, South Africans adopted it for clarity. The British later abandoned it and kind of now act like it was never theirs. And now people roast Americans for a term that originally originated in Oxford. I find it really funny because It's the same as if the Brits invented the term cookies and then marketed it all over the world and then decided it wasn't a good enough term and then go back to calling cookies biscuits. So, anyways, that's my take. Next time you hear someone say it's football, not soccer, give them a little bit of a history lesson and tell them the guys who invented the word football also invented the word soccer. If you like this history lesson, give this channel a like, subscribe, share.